The morning light fell flat across the bank lobby in Glenmore, Ohio. Ethan Cole sat across from the loan officer, calm hands folded, asking for $8,000 to buy a narrow strip of land that looked worthless on paper. The room went quiet for a few seconds. Then it laughed. The branch manager shook his head, smirking, and said Ethan was betting his future on a useless ribbon of dirt. Ethan did not argue. He only signed the papers. No one in that room knew this mock decision would one day stop a $30 million project cold. Glenmore was the kind of Ohio town where the same 5 trucks parked outside the same diner every morning, and the post office still closed for an hour at lunch. Ethan Cole had lived there long enough to know which county clerks took shortcuts and which ones did not. He worked steady hours at a small surveying outfit 2 miles off the state route, the sort of job that paid in checks signed by hand and rewarded patience more than ambition. He owned a small 1-story house at the edge of Maple Hollow Road, paid off years earlier from an inheritance, and kept up by his own hands. It was an arrangement that suited a man whose evenings belonged to Coffee County maps and a stack of public records he renewed at the courthouse twice a year. He had no spouse, no roommates, only a quiet routine built around long drives between property lines and longer nights, tracing easements across photocopied plats. People in Glenmore considered him polite, distant, and a little odd in the harmless way small towns forgive. What no one in town quite understood was how often Ethan read what they did not. Old subdivision filings, forgotten right-of-way clauses, boundary corrections from the 1970s that had been signed by a county engineer, filed once, and never looked at again. He noticed when a parcel was listed twice under different lot numbers. He noticed when a road on the county map ended a foot short of a private boundary. He noticed the things people skip when they assume nothing important is hiding in plain sight. It was on one of those slow Tuesday evenings, with the kitchen light buzzing overhead and a stack of records spread across the table, that he found the strip. A ribbon of land roughly 20 feet wide and 400 feet long, trailing along the edge of a much larger tract owned by a logging family that had moved out of state. On every modern map, it appeared as nothing more than a sliver, an awkward leftover too narrow to build on, too small to farm. Tax assessors had valued it at almost nothing for 2 decades, but on a county survey from 1968, the strip carried a different mark. It was the only recorded access route from the county road into the back acreage of an entire township section. Ethan checked the records 4 times across 3 different evenings before he allowed himself to believe what he was seeing. He could not yet confirm what had happened to the other approaches into that tract, but on the older map, this one stood alone. The strip wasn't useless. It was, at the very least, worth the cost of finding out. The next morning he drove to First Glenmore Savings, parked his pickup between 2 larger trucks, and stepped inside without rehearsing what he would say. He had $1,100 in checking a clean credit history and a willingness to put his small house up as partial collateral. He asked for $8,000, the full asking price the family in Arizona had listed 3 years earlier and never lowered, plus enough to cover filing fees and a clean title search through Daniel Whitaker, a small-town attorney with an office above the hardware store. The loan officer at First Glenmore Savings was Margaret Holloway, a woman in her late 50s who had processed every kind of small-town request and prided herself on knowing a bad idea when she heard one. She read the parcel description twice, pulled up the assessor's screen, and looked at Ethan with the careful expression people use when they are deciding whether to be kind or honest. "You understand this is 20 feet wide," Margaret said. "You can't put a driveway on it without a variance. You can't farm it. You can't put a structure on it. The county values it at $490. "I understand," Ethan answered. She tapped her pen against the desk and called over the branch manager, Raymond Pierce. Raymond was a heavier man with a habit of laughing before he finished a sentence, and he laughed now, halfway through reading the parcel number off the screen. He leaned on the partition and looked Ethan up and down as if measuring him for a joke. "Son, are you sure you don't want to buy the rest of the township while you're at it?" Raymond said. "I've got a swamp out by Route 40 I'll throw in for free." Margaret tried to soften it. Raymond did not. He went on for another minute, riffing about a useless ribbon of dirt and a man betting his future on something a goat couldn't graze on. A teller across the lobby smiled into her sleeve. An older customer in line shook his head. Ethan kept his hands folded on the desk and did not look away from the screen. When the laughter ran out of fuel, Raymond sighed and approved the loan anyway. The collateral was clean, the credit was clean, and the bank lost nothing by lending against a piece of dirt the borrower would obviously default on. He signed the bottom of the form with a flourish and pushed the paperwork across the desk. "Don't say we didn't warn you," he said. Ethan did not answer. He signed each page in the same careful, unhurried script he used on survey reports. Daniel Whitaker handled the title search the following week, without ceremony, finding the records clean and the seller eager. Margaret notarized the closing 2 weeks later. The deed was filed at the county recorder's office on a Friday afternoon in early March, and by the following Monday, the strip on Maple Hollow Road belonged to him. For a while, nothing happened. Ethan kept his job. He kept his routine. He drove past the strip once a week and walked it once a month, mostly to confirm that no one had quietly pushed a fence into it. The neighbors who knew about the purchase called him the man who bought the ribbon, and a few of them stopped him in the hardware store to ask, half amused, what he planned to do with it. He told them the truth, which was nothing. Not yet. The first offer arrived 8 months after the purchase. A surveyor he knew passed his name to a regional contractor who was assembling parcels along the county road, and the contractor sent a 1-page letter offering $12,000 for the strip, a clean 50% profit. Ethan read the letter twice, folded it into the drawer where he kept old utility bills, and did not respond. The second offer came the following spring, this time from a representative of a small commercial broker. $18,000 with a closing window of 30 days. The broker called twice, then drove out to Maple Hollow Road in person, parked in the gravel turnaround, and spent 20 minutes explaining how unusual it was for a piece of land like this to attract this kind of attention. He suggested Ethan was being short-sighted. He suggested the offer would not come again. "I appreciate the visit," Ethan said. The answer is no. The broker drove off, shaking his head, and by the end of that week, 2 of Ethan's co-workers had heard the figure and asked him in different ways whether he had lost his mind. $18,000 on a $490 parcel was the kind of return that men in Glenmore retired on. Turning it down was the kind of decision that turned a quiet man into a stubborn one in the eyes of his neighbors. Ethan did not explain himself. He could have laid out the survey from 1968 and the questions it raised about every other route into that back acreage. He could have shown them what he had been reading on those slow Tuesday evenings. He did not. Explaining would have given away the only thing he owned that mattered, which was the fact that almost no one else had bothered to look. So he held the parcel. He kept the routine. He let the town decide he was a man who had paid $8,000 for nothing and refused to admit it. And when the laughter from the bank came back to him in the late hours of his kitchen, he did not flinch. He had not bought a useless sliver. He had bought time, and time in his experience was the one thing nobody ever offered to buy back. The years did not pass quickly in Glenmore so much as accumulate. Ethan held the parcel, held the job, and drove the same pickup until the odometer rolled past 200,000 miles. Every spring he walked the property line. Every fall he refiled the tax payment in person at the county courthouse. The town stopped asking him about the ribbon of dirt and started treating it the way they treated weather patterns, as something settled and not worth discussing. The offers, however, did not stop. They simply grew stranger and larger. A real estate agent from Columbus called 3 years after the purchase and offered $26,000 on behalf of an unnamed client. A title broker drove out the following summer with a folder of comparable sales and pushed $34,000. By the 7th year, a regional development consultant left a voicemail offering $45,000 cash with no contingencies, calling the strip a piece of leverage rather than a piece of land, which was the first time anyone in those phone calls had used a word that came close to the truth. Ethan listened to each offer the same way he listened to the wind against his kitchen window. He did not return the calls. He did not negotiate. He did not, in any moment of weakness, allow himself to imagine what $45,000 would look like in his checking account at First Glenmore Savings, where Margaret Holloway still occasionally nodded at him from across the lobby with the faint discomfort of someone who had been on the wrong side of a small joke too many times to remember. The pressure was not only financial. His hours at the surveying outfit had been cut back twice during a slow stretch in the regional construction market, and there were months when the difference between making the property tax deadline and falling behind came down to whether he took on weekend fence line work for cash. One February, the pipe in the back wall of his house cracked overnight, and the plumber wanted $700 by the end of the week. Ethan sold an old toolbox the next morning. 2 days later, he sold a generator he barely used. The pipe was repaired before the weekend. The strip stayed on the books in his name. By the 9th year, the gossip in Glenmore had hardened into a kind of folklore. The man who bought the ribbon, the man who turned down $45,000 on dirt nobody could build on. At the diner on Front Street, 2 retirees who had known him since before the loan would sometimes shake their heads when his truck rolled past the window. The kindest version of the story called him stubborn. The less kind version called him a man who could not admit he had been wrong, even when the bank had laughed at him to his face and turned out to be right. Ethan let them say it. He had stopped trying years earlier to explain that a man who knew exactly why he was waiting did not look any different from a man who had simply forgotten to give up. It was in the early autumn of the 10th year that the first heavy machinery rolled through Glenmore. A flatbed truck carrying a tracked excavator turned off the state route and headed up County Road. 11 followed 2 days later by a survey crew in matching Navy windbreakers, then by a second flatbed, then by a delivery of orange marker stakes that filled half a parking lot at the hardware store. The town watched the way small towns watch any sudden investment, with a mix of hope and suspicion. Within a month, signs began to appear on the chain-link fences along the back acreage of the old logging tract. The signs were dark green with white lettering and read, "Sutton and Reeve Development, Group Future Site of the Glenmore Commerce Center." The local paper ran a short piece quoting a corporate spokesperson who described the project as a $30 million mixed-use development with retail frontage, a logistics hub, and parking for over 400 vehicles. Mayor's office, Chamber of Commerce, and the County Economic Development Board all came out in support within the same week. Ethan read the article twice on a Sunday morning, set it on the kitchen table, and did not say anything to anyone. He drove out to Maple Hollow Road that afternoon and walked the strip from end to end. The grass had been cut by a county mower the previous month. The boundary stakes he had hammered in himself 8 years earlier were still standing. From the far end of the strip, he could see the new orange ribbons fluttering on the back acreage where the survey crew had begun marking footprints for the first phase of the development. He had not been certain all those years of what he was waiting for. He had only been certain of what he had seen on the 1968 survey and what he had not seen anywhere else. Now, with the orange ribbons fluttering at the back of the tract and a $30 million sign at the gate, the rest of the picture finally settled into place. To the north, a creek and a wetlands easement no project of that size could legally cross. To the south, a tangled mess of private parcels owned by feuding cousins who had refused to sign anything jointly for 2 decades. To the west, a railroad right-of-way Sutton and Reeve had no realistic chance of acquiring. The only legal vehicular access from the county road into the back of that tract was a 20-foot ribbon of dirt the town had spent 10 years laughing at. The first letter from Sutton and Reeve arrived in mid-October on heavy cream stationery, signed by a junior associate. It opened with congratulations on owning a strategically located parcel and offered $75,000 for an outright purchase. The closing window was 45 days. The letter ended with a polite line about looking forward to a productive partnership. Ethan filed the letter in the same drawer as the utility bills and did not reply. The second letter came 2 weeks later, signed by a senior vice president, and offered $120,000. The third, less than a month after that, was hand-delivered by a courier from Columbus and offered $200,000, with a personal note attached on smaller stationery that read, "We would prefer to do this the easy way." The signature on the personal note belonged to Victor Langston, the lead executive on the Glenmore Commerce Center project, and the first member of the corporation to attach his own name to anything in writing. Ethan called Daniel Whitaker the next morning. Daniel had handled his title search a decade earlier and remembered the parcel because he had quietly admired the patience of the man buying it. He told Ethan to come in that afternoon with every piece of paper he had ever filed on the strip. They sat in Daniel's office for almost 3 hours. Daniel laid the original deed, the 1968 survey, the easement closures from the early 1980s, and the current Sutton and Reeve correspondence across his desk in chronological order. He read each one twice. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at Ethan with something close to disbelief. "You knew," Daniel said. "10 years ago you knew." "I had an idea," Ethan answered. "I wasn't certain until they put up the signs." Daniel's advice was simple and direct. Do not sell. Do not even negotiate a sale. Negotiate a long-term access easement instead, structured as an annual payment for the use of the strip indexed to inflation, with a clear termination clause. Sutton and Reeve would resist because corporations preferred the clean finality of a purchase, but the law was on Ethan's side. The strip was his. The road was theirs to build, but only if they were willing to pay year after year for the right to cross it. Ethan agreed. Daniel drafted the counterproposal that night. The response from Sutton and Reeve arrived within a week, and the tone had changed. The polite cream stationery was gone. In its place came a denser, longer letter on plain corporate letterhead, signed by an in-house counsel Ethan had never heard of, listing 4 reasons why an outright sale was the only acceptable structure. The letter framed an easement as commercially impractical, financially unworkable, and outside the project's lender requirements. It closed with a final offer of $275,000 and a deadline. Ethan let the deadline pass without responding. The pressure escalated in stages, the way it always does when corporations decide a small landowner is more obstacle than asset. First came the visits. A regional director from Sutton and Reeve drove out to Maple Hollow Road on a Saturday morning and stood in Ethan's driveway for almost 20 minutes, talking through the open window of his SUV about reasonable people and unreasonable expectations. Ethan listened, thanked him for stopping by, and went back inside without inviting him in. Then came the local pressure. A member of the County Economic Development Board, who had previously never spoken to Ethan in his life, called him at home one evening and warned in carefully chosen language that a single landowner blocking a $30 million project would not be remembered fondly in Glenmore. A representative from the Chamber of Commerce sent a letter expressing concern. A reporter from the regional paper left 2 voicemails asking for comment on what she described as the bottleneck on County Road 11. Ethan did not return the calls. He drove past the orange ribbons on his way home every day without slowing down. Then the legal pressure began, and that was different. The first filing came in early December. Sutton and Reeve, through a Columbus law firm Ethan had never heard of, petitioned the county for a determination that the strip on Maple Hollow Road no longer carried valid access rights to the back acreage of the old logging tract. Their argument rested on a technicality buried in a 1973 road realignment, a procedural notation that they claimed had implicitly closed the strip's status as a recorded access route at the time the county had repaved County Road 11. The petition was thin, but it was not frivolous. Daniel read it in his office and told Ethan plainly that any judge in the county would have to take it seriously enough to schedule a hearing. The petition would not win on its own, but it didn't need to win. It needed only to create enough doubt about the strip's legal status to discourage any lender from accepting the easement structure Daniel had drafted. In other words, Sutton and Reeve had stopped trying to buy the strip. They were now trying to make it worthless. The hearing was set for late January. In the weeks before it, the corporation filed 2 more motions. The first sought emergency permission to begin partial road construction, arguing that any delay would cost the project tens of thousands of dollars per week. The second requested a court order requiring Ethan to disclose the original survey records and any private notes he had used in evaluating the parcel before purchase. Language that Daniel read as a fishing expedition for anything that could be used to discredit Ethan as a witness. The local press began to turn. The reporter Ethan had ignored ran a story under a headline that called the dispute the $8,000 standoff. And although the article tried to be balanced, it left the impression of a stubborn small-town man holding up a generational investment. 2 letters to the editor followed within a week, both critical of Ethan, neither signed by anyone he recognized. He stopped reading the paper. The week before the hearing, Daniel called him into the office one last time. He had spent 48 hours in the county records room with a paralegal and a yellow legal pad, and he had identified what he believed were 3 solid responses to the road realignment argument. 2 of them were procedural. The third was a single sentence buried in a Board of Supervisors minutes from 1973 that explicitly preserved the access status of all 20-foot strips along County Road 11 during the realignment process. It was the kind of sentence that survived in the public record only because no one had thought it important enough to remove. Daniel was confident. Not certain, but confident. Ethan went home that night and sat at the kitchen table with the original $8,000 loan documents in front of him for the first time in years. The signatures on the bottom of each page were his, written in the same careful hand he had used a decade earlier, across from Margaret Holloway, with Raymond Pierce laughing over his shoulder. He looked at them for a long time, and the kitchen was very quiet. If the court ruled against him, the easement structure would collapse. The corporation would walk away from any payment arrangement. The strip would still legally belong to him, but as a piece of dirt no developer would ever pay for again. 10 years of patience refused offers, and quiet conviction would amount in the end to the $490 parcel the town had always said it was. He folded the documents back into the drawer. He turned off the kitchen light. The hearing was 6 days away. The 6 days before the hearing moved in a way Ethan had not felt in years. He kept the same hours at the surveying outfit, drove the same route past the orange ribbons on County Road 11, and ate the same Tuesday meatloaf at the diner on Front Street. But underneath the routine, every conversation in town seemed to circle the same subject. 2 of his co-workers stopped asking about it altogether, which was its own kind of answer. The clerk at the courthouse who had stamped his deed 10 years earlier looked away when he came in to pull a copy of the original filing. Daniel Whitaker called twice during that week, once to confirm the witness order and once to walk Ethan through the questions the Sutton and Reeve attorneys were likely to ask. The second call ended with Daniel reminding him that the worst thing he could do on the stand was elaborate. Answer what was asked. Do not explain his reasoning. Do not tell the courtroom about the 1968 survey, the closed easements, or the slow Tuesday evenings at the kitchen table. Let the documents speak. Ethan said he understood. The morning of the hearing was overcast and cold, the kind of late January light that turns the brick of the Glenmore County Courthouse the color of wet cardboard. Ethan parked across the square and walked the 2 blocks alone. Daniel was waiting on the courthouse steps with a leather case under his arm and a cardboard box of records at his feet. They went through the metal detector together and took the elevator to the 2nd floor, where the hallway outside courtroom B was already crowded with men in dark suits Ethan did not recognize. Victor Langston stood at the center of them. He was taller than Ethan had expected from the signature on the personal note, with an easy posture and the kind of faint smile a man wears when he has been told the outcome is already arranged. He saw Ethan come around the corner and broke away from the cluster of attorneys to meet him in the middle of the hallway. "Mr. Cole," Victor said, extending a hand Ethan did not take. "There's still time for a conversation that doesn't involve a courtroom. My team can have a check cut by the end of the day. 300,000. We move on, you move on, nobody loses." "My attorney handles that," Ethan said. Victor's smile thinned by a fraction. "Suit yourself." The hearing was presided over by Judge Eleanor Briggs, a woman in her early 60s, whose reputation in the county was for moving fast and tolerating very little theater. She read the petition aloud in summary, confirmed that both sides were represented, and instructed the Sutton and Reeve attorneys to present their argument first. Ethan sat at the defendant's table beside Daniel and listened without expression as the lead attorney for the corporation walked through the 1973 road realignment, the procedural notation, and the claim that the strip on Maple Hollow Road had implicitly lost its status as a recorded access route. The argument was clean. It was professional. It used the kind of language that lands well in courtrooms, where judges are tired and dockets are full. When it ended, the lead attorney sat down with the calm of a man who had performed this exact routine many times before, and Victor Langston did not bother to hide a small nod from the gallery. Daniel rose. He did not begin with the procedural responses he had prepared. He began with the original deed, which he laid in front of the judge, then the title search from 10 years earlier, then the 1968 county survey. He walked through each document briefly, factually, the way a man walks through the foundations of a house he built himself. The strip had been recorded as the sole access route. The easements to the north-south and west had been formally closed in subsequent decades. The strip's status had never been altered by any subsequent filing. Then Daniel reached into the cardboard box and produced a single photocopied page, certified by the county clerk, that morning, of the Board of Supervisors minutes from August of 1973. He handed copies to the judge and to opposing counsel. He read aloud the one sentence that had survived in the public record only because no one had thought it worth removing. The sentence preserved the access status of all 20-foot strips along County Road 11 during the realignment process. It was unambiguous. It was signed. It was filed. The Sutton and Reeve attorneys conferred at their table for almost a full minute. The lead attorney rose to argue that the minutes were ceremonial rather than binding, but Judge Briggs cut him off before he finished the sentence. She had read the same minutes during her own preparation, she said, and she found the language plain on its face. The petition challenging the strip's access status was denied. The motion for emergency road construction was denied. The fishing expedition for Ethan's private notes was dismissed without comment. The hearing ended in less than 90 minutes. Ethan did not move from his chair for several seconds after the gavel came down. Daniel placed a hand briefly on his shoulder and gathered the documents back into the box. Across the aisle, Victor Langston was already on his phone walking toward the courtroom doors with the contained urgency of a man whose afternoon had just been rewritten. The negotiation that followed was not a negotiation in the way the earlier letters had been. It was a recalculation. Within 48 hours of the ruling, Sutton and Reeve's in-house counsel called Daniel directly and asked in plain language what terms Ethan would accept. The corporation had run the numbers overnight. Walking away from the Glenmore Commerce Center would cost them more than any payment Ethan was likely to demand. Building a longer access road through the contested southern parcels would take years of litigation against the feuding cousins. The wetlands to the north were not negotiable. The railroad to the west was not for sale. The 20-foot ribbon on Maple Hollow Road was mathematically the cheapest path forward. Daniel proposed the structure he had drafted 4 months earlier: a long-term access easement, not a sale. An annual payment for the use of the strip indexed to inflation. A clear termination clause Ethan controlled. The corporation accepted the structure within a week and spent the next month negotiating only the figure. The final agreement was signed on a Thursday afternoon in early March, almost exactly 10 years after Ethan had bought the parcel. The annual payment was set at $192,000, indexed to inflation, with a guaranteed term of 40 years and renewal options beyond that. The strip remained Ethan's. The road would be built across it within the year. Sutton and Reeve would pay every January for the right to cross what the bank had once valued at $490. Ethan signed the agreement in the same careful, unhurried script he had used at First Glenmore Savings a decade earlier. Daniel notarized it in his office above the hardware store. Victor Langston did not attend the signing. The news traveled through Glenmore the way news travels in small towns, slowly at first, and then all at once. The diner on Front Street stopped using the phrase, "the man who bought the ribbon," within a week. The reporter who had written the $8,000 standoff piece called twice for a follow-up interview, and Ethan declined both times. The 2 letters to the editor that had once criticized him were never publicly retracted, but their authors stopped showing up in the comments section of the regional paper. At First Glenmore Savings, Margaret Holloway was the one who saw him first. He came in on a Friday morning to set up the deposit account for the annual easement payments. She processed the paperwork herself without making him wait at the counter, and when she slid the final form across the desk, she met his eyes for the first time in years. "I should have looked closer at that file," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't." Ethan took the form, signed it, and slid it back. "Most people don't," he answered. She nodded once and stamped the page. The transaction was done in under 5 minutes. Raymond Pierce was no longer the branch manager. He had been quietly transferred to a smaller branch 2 counties over the previous year, and Ethan never saw him again. The new manager was a younger woman who had no idea who Ethan was, which was its own kind of mercy. He thanked Margaret, took his copies of the deposit paperwork, and walked back out to the truck. The first annual payment arrived in his account that January. The second arrived the following year, slightly higher. By the 3rd year, the road across the strip had been built. The Glenmore Commerce Center had opened its first phase, and the orange ribbons on County Road 11 had been replaced by streetlights. Ethan did not move from the small 1-story house at the edge of Maple Hollow Road. He held on to the truck. He worked the surveying job another 2 years before scaling back to part-time. The drawer where he had once filed offer letters from brokers slowly filled instead with annual statements from the easement account. Most evenings, the kitchen light still buzzed overhead. The county maps were still spread across the table. He still read the things other people did not bother to read, and he still did not explain himself when asked. The town had stopped laughing a long time ago, and that, in the end, was the smallest part of what he had won. True value never lies in how others judge your decision today. It lies in whether you understand what you are doing, and whether you have the patience to follow it to the end, even when the room you stand in is laughing.